Eric Burgess here with Music Marketing TV, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to make some future bass wobble chords. I have an example prepared. Let's take a look at that.
That night began my formal relationship with death. My death. And it also began my long run as a patient. It's a good word. It means one who suffers. So I guess we're all patients to rethink and redesign how it is we die. So, let's begin at the end. For most people, the scariest thing about death isn't being dead. It's dying, suffering. It's a key distinction. Now, another great thing about necessary suffering is that it is the very thing that unites caregiver and care receiver. Human beings. This, we are finally realizing, is where healing happens. Yes, compassion, literally, as we learned yesterday, suffering together.
Alright, so let's dive into that chord sound. How exactly was that thing made? First, we're going to mute the drums, and we're going to solo the chords. So the chords by themselves sound like this. So that's what they sound like, and let's go ahead and begin the deconstruction. So a general overview, Harmor is providing the wobble. This is what's making the chord sound for us. There's an LFO that is controlling a filter. The filter moves back and forth and creates the wobble. There's a couple things going on to get the tone. We're going to get all into that, don't you worry. But I just want to give you a general feel. So we've got a wobble sound. It is coming out of Harmor, and it is going through two paths. So there's this direct path that's just the sound directly out of Harmor. That sounds like this. So that's just the direct sound. It's actually pretty complete already. These are mostly just mixing moves. And this is the send sound. It's going through a Centaurus, which is doing two things for us. It's providing a gated signal, and it's also providing some chorusing. And if we just go ahead and listen to that. And so mixing those together, we get a really nice delay gated sound that just, and also lines up musically with what we're doing. Get those delays after, it's really nice. We go through a stereo shaper. So this guy is doing mid-side. This is just a preset. You can go into mixing, and there is one called mid A-side splitter. And what that does is there's a mid signal that's just going straight out. So if we just listen to the mid signal, it sounds like this. That's only in the middle. And then if we listen to just the side goes through some special treatment. So first it hits a maximus, and all this maximus is doing is pulling the high end up. That's it. It's not doing anything to the lows or the mids, just pulling the high end up. And then there's a transient processor, which has been adjusted like so. I wasn't being super specific. The big thing with this is the release is longer, and this pulls the tail end of the reverby stuff up, but it's not a super big important move. This doesn't have very much impact, so if you don't have this in your chain, don't worry too much about it. It's not super important. But the side sounds like this. So it's way, way, way brighter, and that's courteous due to Maximus. You know what I mean. Maximus did it. Good job, Maximus. When we put them all together, we get that lovely back and forth wobble sound that we all know and love. So let's dive in right at the very beginning, and then we'll work through some of the additional things. The effects actually aren't too complicated. As you saw, they're pretty straightforward. So first up, we have a crude low pass as my filter with a very low width. And that's pretty much the filter. Now, the resonance, again, if you watch the chord retro video, I'm not sure what order these are going to come out in. So I did another video with chords in a retro sort of style of a track. Very, very different style, but a similar resonance move. I'm using well. I believe I used well on that one as well. And no pun intended. If I go to classic, it's going to sound super resonancy. Yeah, it's just gross, right? So well is very important to choose here. And a super high width. So that's the filter setup right there. Now in Harmor, I have it set up so that filter frequency 1, that's what I'm moving. So this is controlling this. And I have it set to the LFO. So the LFO is controlling it, and there's a couple things that are kind of funky to set up that usually aren't as difficult. This is a tempo synced LFO, and in Harmor, you have to do a couple special things to get this. So first, you got to turn the envelope on. You have to turn on tempo, and I also turned on global. Now the reason global's on is so that when I hit 2 notes, the second note starts at the exact point the other note's at in the LFO. So I don't get like 2 mixed wobbles. It's all the same. So I can play like, they all line up. If I take this off, you get that lovely thing, which that could be cool, but obviously it's not what we want. You turn on tempo, but that does not make it tempo sync. The LFO has to be first adjusted, and then a tempo map has to be loaded. So that it sounds like more complicated than it is, and this is just because Harmor gives you a lot more control than most synthesizers do. So first, the speed needs to be adjusted so that when it reads up here, it reads 0.12. If I move this, you see up there it says 000000012. That thing up there. And that is what this needs to be at for this to work. Or not necessarily for it to work, but for it to be adjusted so that it lines up with your actual track. You can go down in, I believe, ratios of 2 and things will still work. But after that, you need to go to the global LFO settings. This sets like all the LFOs, sets how they behave. And in speed, I have a map loaded. Now you can get this from the Loop Talk forums. But if you open up a state file, I have 2 of them. I believe this was posted by Nucleon, if I recall. And basically, it's just a step chart of speed so that when you move, and I mapped it to modulation X. So when I move X around, it selects different wobble speeds. So the wobble speed, ironically, is more complicated than the actual sound itself. But once you have this set up, you can have tempo synced things. I also mapped Y to the amount with a smooth mapping. And so Y controls how much it is affected. This actually might make more sense as a straight line. Don't ask me why I chose to use this. It's an interesting thing, right? You want to make cool music, do weird stuff like this. Do something different, right? That's the idea. All right, so after those 2 moves, and you've got your LFO set up, we go into the Unison. And in the Unison, I have an extremely high order. This is tougher on your CPU, just so you're aware. You could get away doing this with a chorus, but I find that a chorus just doesn't sound the same as the Unison. And so I went with the Unison. There is a very high pitch value, but I believe I also, nope, no articulator. It is just that high. So these are just static settings. And then I changed it to random. I believe it starts on classic. I went with random. I just sort of auditioned them and wanted to see what sounded cool. And then there's a bunch of sort of little odds and ends that you might see, like knobs that were slightly moved. None of those things matter, like the phaser's barely up here. None of that stuff matters. They were just experiments. And then if we come down to the effects tab, I've got a reverb on. And again, this is sort of a strange thing to do in sound design. Where you decide to put your reverb can really impact how things sound later. So I put the reverb in the synth before we hit all the post effects. So that's something that we're gonna need to keep in mind while processing later. We don't want to do anything that's gonna introduce like distortion. Usually, I mean, sometimes it's a great idea, but usually you don't, because it's just gonna end up blowing up in your face because all the reverb's gonna pick that up, and that usually doesn't sound too great. And we've also got a chorus. The chorus has a depth and a relatively high speed, and like a depth of, what is that, 50%? I think this might be the default, but I just put it on 2. And sort of mixing the 2 sounds. That is the patcher, not the patcher, that is the Harmor. And in the advanced tab, I think I changed the order. I can't recall if I moved the filter or not. I may have moved the filter. This changes the order that the processing happens if you're unaware. So you can actually move the filter after different processes, and that can have a big impact depending on what you're doing. So anyways, that's the Harmor. It sounds a little complicated, but in reality, it's just setting up an LFO and getting that resonance move right, and then just pumping up some unison and a little bit of chorus and some verb. The rest of it was like technical details for getting the thing to sync up correctly. All right, so that's what we have here. Sounds like this. So very playable sound on the keyboard right off the bat. So that's already our sound just coming out. So we've already got it pretty set up. But let's go ahead and take a look now what I did to sort of make it a bit bigger, because this is nice, but it doesn't feel as big as it could be. And so the first thing I said is I want to do a split, and on the side I want to toss on a Centaurus, or you could toss on any chorusing plugin, but this plugin is pretty cool because it's got a little mixer with different lines. And that's not very common. Usually choruses come in, come out. There's not like separate channels you can mess with. If we go over to our lines, we've got lines 1 and 2. These are the ones that are on, and line 3 is off. You could tell because on line 3 it's at negative infinity. And we need to know how they're connected to the LFOs. So on the LFO 1 and 2, if we come over to our configuration panel, we see LFO 1 goes to the first one, LFO 2 to the second one. So they're linked up in pairs. Now, taking a look at line 1, this line creates our pumping and our echo, and the second line creates the chorus. So if we look at this, there's actually no depth. So this ain't doing anything when it comes to chorusy kind of things. But the tremolo is at max. And if we look at the LFO, we see that it is synced to eighth notes. And if we go ahead and take out line 2, oh, I've already taken out line 2, and we mute the direct sound, let's just go ahead and hear what that sounds like. So that's what's going on line 1. It's creating a little bit of pumping, but more importantly, it's creating the echo. The pumping's not really going to matter because first we have another line 2, that's got the chorusing, and we're mixing it with a completely separate signal anyways. So I didn't mind it at all. And if anything, it reinforces some of the rhythms that we're using. So I thought it was really cool. Now, if we bring in line 2 and take out line 1, can you hear it? And all this is doing is just your classic chorusy kind of stuff. Nothing insane over here. So mixing them together, and let's just hear them together. And you can hear at the beginning, there's like a little sucking motion at the beginning because of that initial pump. And then it sort of just evens itself out. So again, the pumping here, when you isolate it, it sounds more severe than it actually is in the context of the whole sound. Now this is a preset. It's called Chariots. You can go ahead and check it out. I really like, I say this in every video, but their presets are just fantastic. So the only move that you might want to consider messing with is the echo move on line 1 if that bothers you. So all right, so this is coming out, and let's go ahead and turn back our other sound. This is going into the Fruity Stereo Shaper. We've already talked about this, so I'm just gonna breeze through it. Again, this is just a preset that's on mixing a side splitter. So that comes out, and here's our mid. And so this is just the mid information. And we have our side, which I think I've had muted this entire time. So if we listen to just the mid, and now if we turn on the side, that's the side, and we've already discussed that that's just the high end being pulled up. These kinds of moves with mid-side are things I'm always trying to get students to do because they're just things they haven't experimented with yet, and they sound complicated to set up, but they're really not. Now, in Patcher, in order to set this up, you actually have to create a second output. So you see this on, it says on in-out difference 2. Well, if you go in and you go to outputs, you can create a new one, and I'm using send to. And that's how I know that it's being sent. If I change this to like 1, I'll have to choose the output on 1. If you were in the mixer, it would just, you would see it pop up 2 mixer channels later. Or if you choose 1, it would, the audio would be sent to one mixer channel later, and that would be your side information, and then you'd have your mid information. So that's how I'm splitting it internally inside of Patcher. And that's the patch, that's the whole thing. So now you know. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed